reminder for the group, for everyone really, that if you're not at it, you don't have the right to turn up and win any game of football. Firstly, we have to look internally, us as players. Did we do enough? The answer is no. Callum McGregor speaking in the aftermath of Celtic's 1-0 defeat to Kilmarnock at the weekend in the League Cup. This is the Huddle Breakdown. I'm Enda and Alan, and I'm joined by Alan Morrison today. Alan, it's Tuesday now. The game was on Sunday. A few games have passed. I've been mulling over this game and I really haven't come to terms with it just yet. What have you been thinking over the last couple of days since this game?
Yeah, I mean, clearly disappointing. It doesn't quite cover it. Um, and actually compounding that is when you watch it back is just that Celtic actually started reasonably well in the first sort of 8 to 10 minutes. Kyogo and O'Reilly had decent shots from quite slick passing moves, which is I think is what Celtic are trying to do in the final third, get combinations between the midfielders, the wide players, and the striker. Quick passing, quick moving, and that worked quite well. But I think for me, the most disappointing thing was the longer it went on, the worse it got. And although I think the subs did brighten it up a little bit, especially the wide players, Yang and Haksabanovic, it was just a horribly flat, unfocused performance. I didn't really know what we were trying to do. I'm not being glib. I just genuinely wasn't sure what the objective was in terms of how were we going to build attacks, how were we going to score goals. Um, I think in the last two league games, which, as I say, in the end, Celtic won comfortably. Sort of around about three xG in both games. Yes, we gave up lots of chances too, but they were, as I mentioned, they were kind of redolent of Ange's early games. A lot of chances at both ends, but Celtic got created a heck of a lot. And in that basis, it was a bit, unstructured and it was a bit chaotic, but there was a lot of good stuff as well. This was none of that. And even, again, I hope people will feel that over the time we've done this podcast, we do try and give credit where it's due to the opposition. It wasn't even as if Kilmarnock were exceptional. They really weren't. They really weren't. They didn't really put a lot of pressure on the Celtic goal. They didn't create much. What they did do, I think, was well, but we foretold this by watching their first two games, was they negated one of great Celtic's great strengths, which is, pressing and counter pressing, because they simply didn't dwell on the ball at the back. They just launched it forward as quickly as they got it. And I think we said last week that of all the teams in the league, Kilmarnock have got the highest ratio of passes completed in the position half versus their own half. They simply don't want to play at all in their own half. And what that did effectively was negate, Maida, Kyogo, O'Reilly especially. Their strengths are pressing, counter press, trying to win the ball back high. I've only got as far as sort of midway through the second half, as far as collecting my own data. But up to that point, Celtic didn't win the ball back, or Kilmarnock. Put it another way, Kilmarnock did give the ball away in their own defensive third once, and that's remarkable for a Celtic game. So I think that's just the nature of how they played. They launched it forward. I don't think they particularly caused Celtic huge numbers of problems. But then a lot of it was, an artificial pitch. The ball bounces kind of straight up in the air rather than more predictably like it does on grass. And therefore, Celtic were forced into a lot of unfocused headers or clearances that then make it all just a 50-50 mess. And, fair play, that's what they were trying to do. And that was their approach. But all in all, as I say, I don't believe Kilmarnock were particularly outstanding, but we were absolutely shambolic, really, because as I say, there was just no. I didn't see what we were trying to do. That was what it comes down to. That's the most disappointing thing. I don't mind a plan implemented badly or mistakes, but when you just don't see a plan, that's more worrying, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why the reaction to this has been so dramatic or vitriolic from the Celtic fans, was that it was just so bad. And I would urge anybody to actually go and watch and read Cal McGregor's words after this game, because he was pretty scathing of his teammates after this. And you know what? Like, Cal McGregor didn't have a great game either, but he is the captain, so it is sort of his job to come out and take responsibility and almost get his teammates to get a kick up the arse that this game really is. He was very strong on the fact that, there's new players coming into the club, but that doesn't matter. That, you should be coming up and turning up for this game. And even for the players who are at the club multiple times for multiple years already, he almost said that, they almost turned up entitled to win this game against Kilmarnock, and you just don't get that no matter who you are. A lot of people said since this game that this is a sign the Celtic need bodies in, but I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that sort of idea that, a 1-0 loss to Kilmarnock in the League Cup on an artificial pitch is the reason that Celtic need new signings in, because the players that are at Celtic should be good enough to beat Kilmarnock away in the League Cup. What I do think is necessary, though, is a wake-up call for this team, Alan, because Brendan Rodgers is a good manager, but since he's come back, it's been flat. The preseason was flat. The first two games were flat, and the speed in which Celtic are playing has dropped dramatically. And I think that's one of the key issues here, is that you're playing against Kilmarnock. Okay, they're going to set back. Well, how do you counter that? Well, you play through their game. You don't let them get back into shape quickly. So you play quick, you play fast passes, you get the ball forward. And Celtic were getting the ball, getting it to the forwards. They were going back to the midfielders, back to the defenders, and restarting it. And by the time they got the ball up the pitch, Kilmarnock had 10 men behind the ball already. So it just felt like they didn't have a plan. And even if they did have a plan, they weren't implementing that plan, because I would say that Brendan Rodgers would not have put them out on the pitch and said, okay, lads, recycle possession, keep hold of the ball as much as you can, and get forward when you can. I would say he would have said, go at Kilmarnock quickly. And I feel like this was a failure to implement any game plan, as opposed to just not having one. Or, I think it was a player failure, like almost an attitude failure, as opposed to any sort of lack of standards or lack of game plan.
I mean, you have to feel a bit sorry for, I think some players came out of that game not looking good, especially the fullbacks, who looked ponderous and, like you say, look to get the ball in reasonable positions and then turn back and start again. The two new fullbacks, who I don't think you can really blame, two relatively young players that have been pitched in together, a lot of passing back and forth between them. But that all is all. There's two things really I always think about that. One is, yeah, is there sufficient movement up front? So McInnes, again, this is why I'm not particularly effusive in my praise for McInnes, because he didn't do anything that he hasn't done a dozen times before against Celtic and lost virtually every game, and he keeps doing the same thing. But this time they won. Okay, so I guess that's the law of averages as well. But this man-to-man marking was going to be expected. We've actually had it in 3 games, and there is not just responsibility on the person being marked to get themselves into a good position. There's also responsibility on the passer to be brave enough to pass the ball to somebody who is being marked. And I mean, that might sound obvious, but a lot of times a footballer, especially if they've got a slightly negative mindset or not quite switched on 100%, will see a player and a defender near them and then just think, oh, okay, I'm not going to give the ball away, I'm going to look bad. When actually, you know, if you see, I don't know, Callum McGregor wide on the right and his left foot is furthest from the defender, and you think, okay, if I hit his left foot, he's going to take that ball in, and then that's then a trigger for Matt O'Reilly to run past him or whoever. That's how you do it, and you then play through. Um, and we didn't do that. We weren't brave in our passing, and we maybe weren't brave in our running. I think there's also a compounding factor in terms of the wide players that we had. And this is building on something that, I think Tony McLaughlin made the point on Twitter this morning very well, that Ange Postecoglou only about 4, maybe 5 times in 2 years played Abada and Maeda at the same time. And the reason being mainly is because he had Jota, and if Jota was fit, you played him. But also it's the balance that gave to the attack, because you could fire the ball at Jota at any height, pace, or direction, and he would generally master the ball. And even if he was being marked, even though he wasn't sort of top end speed, he was skillful enough to get half a yard to do something with the ball, whether it was get across in the next pass and link the play, and then you're building. But if you look at and Maida on the other side, or Abada on the other side, he gave you that more direct running. So you had a nice balance on either side, and the defense couldn't gamble too much in terms of how high and how aggressively they pressed, because if they pressed Jota really hard, then suddenly there was a lot of space in behind. With this lineup, Abada's really doesn't offer a lot 50 yards from goal. He comes to life if you get the ball around the edge of the box, and he's good at quick movement, quick passes, and everything done at speed. Maida, as we know, wants to run in behind. If you give Maida the ball 50 yards from goal out on the touchline, generally speaking, I mean, it happened 2 or 3 times. I'm being humorous, but 2 or 3 times it took him. He didn't control the ball until he was back on the halfway line, and so yeah, he'd actually mastered the ball. He very rarely. In fact, it was only once he got the ball wide on the left hand side. It was early in the game, and he crossed into Kyogo, and Kyogo had a difficult shot, and that was it. In the first half, both Taylor and Maida were the most voluminous recipients of forward passes, and neither created a forward pass themselves. So we were finding these players in good situations. We're taking people out of the game. Lagerbielke, some great passing out to Maida, and then it would just break. It just nothing. Then it would come back, or nothing would happen after that. Nothing creative. But I don't want to put the blame all on the two wide players, because when we have a poor performance, there's a multitude of things. We've got to face up to a number of different things here. We've got an aging Hart, we've got an aging McGregor. We saw with McGregor again a yellow card because when the opposition broke, he just doesn't have the speed that he had before, and he had to bring the guy down. Hart was actually, I think, okay in this game, but again, there was a couple of loose passes. But we've got this incredible run of injuries at centre half. We've got our two best defenders out. We've got a left back in Taylor who seems to be utterly bereft of confidence. I mean, like completely, all confidence is drained from him. He's hesitant. He doesn't know what to do with the ball. He's unsure of himself. He's either rushing and hoofing it, or he's taking too long and getting caught in possession sometimes. And then we've got the age-old, problem of the midfield combination. We brought Home in. Home had some lovely touches, won a couple of nice tackles, but was generally peripheral to the game. He's a young player. This was a very alien environment to him. He couldn't get on the ball. And then we've got the issues with the two wide players that we've talked about. So that's a lot of that's a lot of tactical concerns there. And as we've talked about on this show a lot, it's the compounding nature of those things. If you add them all up together, any one of those things in isolation is probably manageable against Kilmarnock away. But the compound negative variance introduced by all of those things added together will potentially lead to this sort of fragmented performance.
Yeah, and I think to start with the wingers point that you're making there. Now, I was very optimistic about Maeda's role in the Celtic team this year at the start of the season. That was based upon Brendan Rodgers playing a similar tactic that he played at Leicester. He seems to have reverted back a little bit to a more possession-based build-up at Celtic, which I do not think suits Maeda at all. He's not good enough on the ball to expect him to do these things. He is fast presser, get behind, get at the opposition. He's not a put the ball into him and he'll control it and link up the play. That's just not what Maeda is good at. Neither is Abada. So I think expectancy to do that is probably unfair and not what you would expect Brendan Rodgers to put that sort of pressure on these players, because I'm sure he knows they're not good enough to do it. And then Yang came on, and Brendan Rodgers did say that Yang sort of brought more to the game than what was on the field before him. whether Marco Tilio is the player that Celtic have lined up as that Jotas-esque player who is good on the ball and is capable of getting at players, that's yet to be seen because he's still that injured. But at the minute, it's just not working. And then in terms of the general overall play with the fullbacks, again, I think it's a similar issue. Is that Greg Taylor was on the ball quite a bit for Celtic last year, but it was a completely different thing that he was being expected to do. He was really keeping it simple last year, and he's expected to be almost a creative spark this year. And I just don't think Greg Taylor is good at that. So it's getting to the point now where all of these factors are building up alongside these injuries with Cameron Carter-Vickers, Navrosky's out injured, Stephen Welsh is going to be out injured for a couple of months now, Hatate, who knows how long he's going to be out for, Kobayashi's out injured. So Celtic have all the issues that you've mentioned, plus the injury issues, plus a very difficult run of fixtures coming up over the next couple of weeks, including a trip to Ibrox. And add all that up with the fact that Brendan Rodgers was never going to get as much time to bed in as another manager who didn't leave in the middle of a season a couple of years ago would have with the fans. And you've just got this deluge of absolute negativity after one defeat at the start of the season. If you compare Celtic start of the season, and this is where I'm a little bit torn on whether or not it should be compared with Ange's first season at Celtic. So his start to the season, if you don't include the European games, which, I mean, there was a couple of losses in there as well, but in terms of domestic performances, Ange had obviously the loss to Hearts at the start of the season, first game, lost to Rangers at Ibrox, and then lost to Livingston. Cal McGregor mentioned the Livingston result in his post-match comments as well, is that that's sort of where he feels this team is at, that they need to really just cop on now and get up and tuned with the system. As did Brendan Rodgers. He said that it shouldn't matter that Kilmarnock have played 7 games this year already, that Celtic have played enough games in preseason to know that they what they have to do and what they don't. But what I do need to probably point to here, which I think is an interesting comparison, is Ange's comments after I believe it was the Michelin game, which was one of the first games of the season. And he said that I've obviously not done enough to convince people that we need to bring people in. I'm not going to shy away from that. I've been trying to be as forceful as I can with what we need to bring in, and the challenges we have faced, they're well chronicled. So this was around the time when Don Mackay was still here and trying to get signings in. It just wasn't working. After this game, Brendan Rodgers was asked about transfers, and he said, I think you can see that we need quality. We've had quality go out the building, so we need to get quality in. Is that a warning to the Celtic board in a similar vein as Ange's warning after the Michelin results?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect we'll cherry pick to make an analogy work and forget other things. But it was interesting. Callum McGregor is more of an expert than you and I, having lived and breathed it. It was interesting that he focused on that Livingston game and made the analogy of, because that was another sort of hapless performance where the team looked lost, trying to combat what was a very sort of basic form of football that we've seen many times before and we'll see again in Scotland. Um, so that was fascinating, I think. And the comments, like you say, were very similar from the managers. Listen, we've talked about this, and I guess, a loss validates those who are impatient from getting hundreds of players in the door. Uh, as you said, it's not as simple as that. We're here to develop players as well. We're here to make the ones that have signed up to long contracts, improve them, make them fit into a coherent system as well. But Rodgers is absolutely right. We've lost a great deal of experience in Starfelt. Jota, he's relatively experienced, played a lot of games for Celtic, etc. And we've lost a lot of, as Anja had to battle with, of experience to injury. Best defender, best fullback. We've lost, Hitati, who, relative to the players we've brought in, Hitati's now become one of the more experienced players. I mean, we often refer to him as a young player, but actually, he's now an experienced player in relative terms compared to some of the people we bought in. And we have bought in true to our trading model. But what we haven't done is brought in those, more experienced, battle-worn, perhaps Champions League, ready, proficient type of signings that I think we hoped would be there at some point, and still do. As I say, I don't believe the intent has changed. I still believe there's an intent. There was always an intent in 3 to 4 players of that nature. I think there still is that intent. There may have to be more because of Jota and Starfelt leaving, which wasn't completely expected, and obviously Moy retiring. I mean, again, I come back to Moy's a huge risk and a huge miss, really, in terms of his experience and his ability to cope with these types of situations and bring calm and composure to the team. So yeah, listen, a lot to deal with. A huge injury list, especially in the centre half department, and we're having to be patient because we're shopping, as I say, in this market of signings. I think we're trying to get who, will probably leave it as late as possible in the window to resolve their futures because we're probably looking at players who are going to have choices and are going to have choices in very competitive leagues. So you know, it's a gamble. It always is a gamble. But what do you do? Do you just say, well, we're not going to chase those players. We'll get another 2.5 million signing from Armenia or whatever, and you've got another body in the door. I think we need to be true to what we're trying to achieve. If it was the right decision in June, it's probably still the right decision now. But what is concerning is if we, when we started the season or talked at pre-season and we listed what are the 5 things you're most concerned about, I don't think any of those things have been resolved. Arguably, the centre half position was, I think, last week for about 10 minutes, and it was literally 10 minutes between, Lagerbielke signing, Stephen Welsh signing a new contract, and then Stephen Welsh being injured. When it looked like we had 4 centre halves that I was kind of happy with. Now, you can't go and sign loads of players just because you have injuries. That's just a fact of life. People are going to have to step up. And I think it's probably made Liam Scales and Kobayashi's situations quite interesting. But yeah, listen, there's a lot there. There's a lot more. As I said to you before, the scales are falling off my eyes to use that word, in the sense of there's an awful lot more happening here and a lot more to resolve than I thought. I thought it'd be tweaking and enriching and bringing more quality into the squad. Maybe that's obviously a very simplistic view. There's just a huge amount more to do. And I think just one last point on that game in terms of Celtic's performance is it was very telling to me, the fact that you can obviously use 5 substitutes and Celtic only used 3. So, what does that say about the players that didn't come on? The team's playing terrible, nothing's being created, and yet you're not deemed good enough to come on and change the game. For example, Taylor was clearly struggling when he got that elbow to the head and he was bleeding, and it took like 3 minutes to patch him up. Why didn't you just say, right, sod it, this is going to take too long, just chuck Bernabe on? You know what I mean? What harm would it have done? Would it really have been any worse? Yeah, but what some other players on the bench there that didn't kind of feature. So this is all part of it. This is all part of Rodgers looking at the squad and going, who do I trust, who do I not trust? And it just seems like it's a heck of a bigger job than what we realise, which is, as I say, the dawning realization for me, certainly.
Yeah, I think context is probably needed, or a little bit of realism is needed. So if you look at the squad as a whole, obviously the goalkeeping position, we don't need to talk about it any further. We all agree that there needs to be improvements there. I think if you have a fully fit squad, so this is taking injuries out of it. If you have a fully fit squad, Cameron Carter-Vickers and Mike Nawrocki is a good enough partnership, in my opinion. Lagerbielke, Stephen Welsh are good enough replacements. If Alistair Johnson is fully fit, then Alistair Johnson is a absolutely solid right back, and we have a good replacement in Anthony Ralston as a backup. Greg Taylor for me needs to be upgraded on, but he's a good backup option to have. So left back is still a position that I think we need to make improvements on. In centre mid, and Cal McGregor, Rio Atate, and Matt O'Reilly is a good enough starting trio for this year, with home good enough to be a backup. So I think the midfield is somewhere that we need to look to improve on, and Turnbull as well as a replacement for Matt O'Reilly. So you probably look at another body in there at least. If we're not going to bring anybody else in, then we might be struggling there. And then in the forward line, if O is fit, I think he's a fine replacement for Kyogo. I think Tilio is probably going to be a starter based on the opening games with Maeda and Abada as the starters. So Maeda is a fine replacement. Abada is probably a good enough starter if we get to a point where we're actually attacking with his strengths and optimizing for his strengths. I don't think he's a good enough starter if we're going to play the way that we're currently playing. I think we need a more dominant ball playing winger. If that's Yang, then it could be Yang. So I think we're almost there. We're probably about 80% there in terms of the squad, but I do agree. I do think there is definitely improvements need to be made in some key positions. Am I as worried as probably the majority of the fan base that I saw on Twitter? I'm probably not. I think we are still early doors in this, and one loss shouldn't mean throwing the baby out with the bathwater and going and spending stupid money on wages on a player who plays in the Premier League and go back to a model of, filling gaps where needed on the last day of the transfer window. So I don't know, maybe I'm a bit optimistic on the side of things. Probably most people would agree with me at this point in time, but looking back at that result against Kilmarnock, the game was bad, the performance was bad, but I always go back to, okay, is this squad good enough to get a result if they actually kick it up a gear and play to their best of their ability? Yes, they probably would have still won that game. And I know that's not good enough for progression in the Champions League, and I'm completely on board with the need for real upgrades in terms of the Champions League. But in terms of domestically, I think Celtic are absolutely fine for this year. They just need to make those incremental improvements in goalkeeper, left back, centre mid, and in the forward line. I think they still need 4 good signings, but I wouldn't hold my breath in that happening this summer. I can't see it regardless of the Jota money or not. Or perhaps, Alan, perhaps Jota will replace Jota because it looks like his time at Al Ittihad is coming to an end. So, I mean, am I being too optimistic? Am I looking at this with Brendan Rodgers tinted glasses on?
So yeah, I guess that's fair, and certainly domestically, I tend to try and look at it through a sort of Champions League lens, and I'm almost too scared to talk about that in terms of how far we are off competing at that level at this moment in time. But you're absolutely right in the sense of, injuries will happen. They've happened for a multitude of reasons. Some of them were inherited. Some of them, like Stephen Welsh, was just a freak sort of training ground thing that can happen. So that's life. Again, as I've said before, Celtic got a bigger squad than most in Scotland, and therefore should be able to, work around that. And so, are you being over optimistic? I don't think so, but again, we kind of make the assumption that, like for example, Callum McGregor is the same Callum McGregor as he was last year, and I don't think that's the case. So you constantly have to really have an eye on those things as well. And then there those players like that Rogers maybe just doesn't fancy, that we didn't realise that would be the situation, and there might be a couple of those as well. So as I say, for me, I'm probably slightly more worried only on the basis I think there's a ton more work to do than what I keep coming back to, than what I actually envisaged. And then, I know we're kind of running out of time, but we do have to, for me, we do have to mention Alan Muir, because again, you know, Celtic were awful. They didn't deserve to win. What is also can be true at the same time is that yes, but they expect to be given a fair crack at it in terms of refereeing performance. Yorkshire Whistler looked at the sort of 3 big calls in that game, and he was very pressed for time for personal reasons. I'm very grateful for him to turn it around quite quickly. On the Greg Taylor Armstrong elbow to the head, he was clear that was a clear red card. If you look at the highlights or read the BBC Match Report, you won't even see of that. That was an absolutely crucial decision. Greg Taylor went off the pitch for about 3 minutes, and the same player who elbowed him in the head crossed the ball from the position that Taylor was supposed to be marking to set up the winning goal. So that had a huge impact on the game. The goal itself, the Yorkshire Whistlers' view based on the highlights was it was so close that you'd give the benefit to the attacker, and I would agree with that watching the video. But if you look at the image that we were given of the VAR decision, um, the line that's been drawn for where the attacker is has been drawn in the wrong place, because it's been drawn 3/4 of the way through Watkins' head, when actually he's leaning forward at a really steep angle, and his left shoulder, which he can score with, it's that t-shirt line, is way in advance of his head, and so the line is literally been drawn in the wrong place. Now, I don't. Had you drawn the line in the right place, it still looks incredibly tight to me, and it still may have been a goal. But the point is that there's a an officiating error there, and it's public data, it's public knowledge. The line is in place, right? And then you get the Haksabanovic being clipped down in the last minutes, which again, Yorkshire Whistler view was clear penalty. That seemed to either not get reviewed at all, or it was reviewed and done with within about 10 seconds. And you sort of think, well, people misquote, or not misquote, people misuse and abuse the old Jock Stein saying about, well, if we're good enough, the referees don't matter. What Jock Stein was doing was two things. One, he was being very bullish about how good his team what actually was, and putting the fear in people. And it was just the oldest trick in the book. He was putting pressure on referees. He wasn't saying, oh, and by the way, if we're rubbish, refereeing mistakes don't matter. He wasn't saying that, because that's clearly ludicrous. And in this case, Celtic were rubbish. Kilmarnock stuck to their game plan doggedly. The referee made at least two huge errors that ultimately swung the game, and that's it. So, you know, all the reaction, and a lot of the commentary that follows the game is predicated on the result.
Mm.
Had Celtic won that game 1-0 with a late penalty against 10-man Kilmarnock, I'm sure there'd have been lots of praise about plucky Kilmarnock, and and a lot of commentary in the Celtic universe would have been about, well, that wasn't a great performance, but we dug in and we showed resilience, and we got the job done in the end. Very different narrative, you know. And these things matter. They matter hugely. Celtic's, Rogers' record's gone, Celtic's treble gone, all those things. And why? Because a referee and a VAR and actually a VAR official. I don't actually, in both those incidents, arguably, Muir could have been forgiven for not quite picking them up in real time. But the excuse of, oh well, the referee's only got one look and it happened so fast, that doesn't fly anymore.
Mm.
They can look at it endlessly. They can look at it many times as they want. And if you look at those decisions as many times as you want, they're not difficult decisions. So where does that leave us?
You're on a Stonewall penalty when even Barry Ferguson is saying he'd be raging if he didn't get the Haksabanovic penalty. That was a Stonewall penalty. The red card, I agree with you, should have been definitely considered longer, if not, overturned, and the right decision made. The offside one, I can't find myself getting too upset about. Marginal calls are always going to end up going the strikers' way. They generally do. We're not operating off the same system as the Premier League. I've always said this. I said it from the start of VAR in Scottish football. Scottish football should not be using VAR until the technology is good enough to use. I mean, and these decisions are going to keep happening because the technology is not good enough to use in the professional game. It's as simple as that. Remember the offside call? The camera angle was like 100 yards away from the gameplay. That's the shit you're going to have to deal with in Scotland with VAR, with the current technology that you're using. So,
Hey, Enda, I accept that. Therefore, what you expect is that there's going to be crappy calls based on that for all sides. And guess what? We've seen 3 examples of lines not being drawn correctly, or the technology being used badly, that I can recall over the last 2 seasons. The Jota one, which was taken from a skyscraper 14 miles away. The one at Motherwell when the Rangers were playing there, and Sakala's goal was allowed to be offside, and subsequently it was shown the lines were drawn in the wrong place. And then the one yesterday and Sunday, sorry, where again it may still have been level, I don't know, but the line was demonstrably the line's been drawn in the wrong place. What's the common denominator with all these three things? Who does it benefit? Who does it harm? So you're right in what you say, but then the outcomes of those errors and of that limitation technology should be everyone suffers equally.
Yeah, I mean, that's a deeper issue that we don't have time to get into at the minute on today's podcast because um, technology has actually worked against us today. So we're operating off Zoom, which I only have a 40-minute subscription for, in which there is 2 minutes left in this recording. So in 30 seconds, then, Alan, or as close to 30 seconds as you can get it, what's going to happen next? What is Brendan Rodgers' reaction? What is the team's reaction? Do you see this being turned around very quickly and obviously like almost fixed this weekend?
It has to be a process. There has to be clearly the players are not implementing, as you say, successfully. Whether that's because they can't or they won't, we don't know. Hopefully, it's the former. But yeah, there clearly has to be improvement, as there was under Postecoglou. It took probably 6 to 9 months to become coherent, and then it became super efficient in sort of season two. So we have to remember that, and this is probably going to be a similar process, all whilst having to deal with a very heavy injury list, which is disruptive, especially when it takes some of your better players away. I'm still hopeful we're going to get 3 or 4 significant bodies in the door, although time is running out. So yeah, always optimistic. We have been here before. Yeah, we have to be careful not to overreact, I guess is what I'd conclude on.
And that is probably what I'll conclude on as well. My one message would be to pretend the 25 million for Jota never happened, because Celtic do not have 25 million just sitting there ready to be used. Okay. Just remember that it has to be used across multiple seasons, because that's likely the way that Celtic are getting the money. So transfers will happen. Better transfers take longer to happen. In the next 10 days,
Yeah.
there's loads to be positive about then. And Celtic are going to get a win this weekend. And that is as much time as we have left on this recording. So thank you very much to everybody who's listening or watching. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button.